Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thanks to our guest, Dr. Jasser Auda, and his wife, who's also visiting, for agreeing to come and present on a very interesting topic, a great start to the beginning of the academic year. The question, or the topic, is defining Sharia between the Arab Spring and America. I think this is very interesting for anybody who's interested in the question of Muslims and Islam in America, as well as Muslims and the ideas of Islamic law and government in the Middle East, which is, of course, a very important topic that anybody who watches the news, even briefly, has heard mentioned numerous times, probably in the last 2 years. Dr. Jasser Auda is Deputy Director and Associate Professor at the Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics, which is part of the Qatar Foundation in Doha, Qatar. He's also a member, sometimes founding member of a number of other organizations and institutes that study issues of Islam, Islamic law, Muslims in Europe, Muslims in the West, issues of Islamophobia. And he comes out with another book about every 2 weeks, which means he and Dr. Esposito are going to have to have a showdown at some point.
We're going to have a shootout.
Yeah, exactly. It might be dangerous in here.
Ego against ego.
The latest ones are Maqasid al-Shariah as philosophy of Islamic law, a systems approach, and Between Sharia and Politics, Questions in the Post-Revolutions Era. So he'll speak, Dr. Auda will speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments, hopefully a very interesting discussion. And his talk is being recorded, so any obnoxious remarks or something like that, or exclamations of joy will be recorded as well.
No, we can edit them out if we get into somebody's life. We like that. A little gossip doesn't hurt.
Well, hello everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings. Peace. Thank you, Jack, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored. I think the topic is very important to discuss in a certain way that is sophisticated and informed, rather than dogmatic and simplistic. And I'm not concerned about how big the crowd is, because I'm more concerned about how informed and how willing the audience are to engage in a conversation on the topic of Sharia, with a willingness to understand the complexity of the topic and the multi-dimensionality of the topic, and the different contexts in which we're talking about Sharia. I was very surprised. I spent the summer here in the States for the first time, I think. I spent many summers in Canada when I used to live there, but the first summer to spend in this area. And I was very surprised to hear a lot of talk about Sharia. Coming from the Middle East and in the Arab Spring countries, there is a lot of talk about Sharia too. And then I started to compare the two debates in the Arab world about the Sharia and the debate here about the Sharia. And I found striking similarities in the debates between people who take different positions on the Sharia over there and people who take similar positions on the Sharia, similar definitions and similar conceptions of it here. Very interesting. What is Sharia? Sharia is an Arabic word. I often hear in the media here, when I tune into something about the Sharia, people talking about the Sharia law or Sharia, and then they translate it as Islamic law. And to my understanding, and I teach Sharia in the Islamic studies colleges, Sharia is not accurately translated as Islamic law. Sharia could find its way to the law in the modern sense, in some senses, but Sharia originally is not law. Sharia originally is, in English, the best word would be ethics. Basically, people practice Sharia. What is Sharia? Shara'a yashru in Arabic. When we say Sharia, Sharia means a way. The origin of the word is the way that the camels follow to the water in the desert. And therefore, it's a way of life. It's a road, a middle path. It's translated in English in these terms, a way. And it is an ethical way of life that is connected to the Muslim conception of spirituality. It has a lot to do with the Islamic acts of worship and rituals and relationship between a Muslim as a believer and his or her God, and so on. This is what the Sharia is about. We do have to differentiate between a number of things, and allow me please to explain that. We do have to differentiate between what's called Sharia and what's called fiqh in Arabic. Sharia means that the way that God prescribed to us. In the Quran it says, we had appointed for you, Muhammad, a way. And the word Sharia is, we had, ثم جعلناك على شريعة. The word Sharia is used in the Quran. We had appointed a way for you. So Sharia, or when we say Ash-Shari', it is often translated as the lawgiver, but it is the Sharia giver, the God, really. When we say the founder of the Sharia or the giver of the Sharia, it is God. But when we talk about the human understanding of that way, of that revelation, we start to talk about what's called a faqih. A faqih, or a jurist, is a human. We're not supposed to call God a faqih, because in the Islamic, classical sense, a faqih is a human that can make mistakes. But we don't believe as Muslims in our faith that God makes mistakes. This is not in the Islamic theology. Islamic theology that God is perfect. But the understanding of the way that God revealed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a human endeavor to understand. So fiqh is understanding. That understanding could be right and could be wrong. And that understanding could change with the change of time and place and circumstances and so on. We have a number of factors in fiqh that we know that our fiqh should change with. So the change of time, the change of place, the change of circumstances, the change of cultures or customs, the change of intent, and the change of the way we deal with authority, and I will talk about that when we talk about law. So Sharia is divine, but fiqh is human. Sharia is complete, but fiqh is by definition imperfect. And when we talk about the application of the Sharia in the Arab world, for example, this is something that is said in a way of metaphor, because it is really the application of fiqh rather than the application of the Sharia. It's an understanding, and understanding could differ. So that is one distinction that is important to make. It is also important to make a distinction between Sharia as ethics and Sharia as law, because Sharia is originally ethics. Sharia is originally for people to practice, but it is not for the authority to enforce. This is not what Islam is about. Yes, Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Prophet, had an authority, but in this science of Sharia, we differentiate between Muhammad as a leader and Muhammad as a messenger. And as I said in the beginning, this is going to be a bit complex, but this is important to understand. And we refer to this as the intent of prophethood versus the intent of leadership. We say that when Muhammad, peace be upon him, does or says things with the intent of leadership, then these things are, first of all, not infallible. These things could be subject to error. He could make errors and mistakes in his leadership decisions and his leadership actions. And these things are changeable in his lifetime and throughout time as well. So Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his intent of leadership is an example by principle and not by form, by essence rather than by form. But Muhammad, in his intent as a conveyor of the message, we say, is an example by essence and form. So therefore, as a prophet, he taught Muslims how to pray, taught Muslims how to do pilgrimage, how to, and so forth. But as a prophet, he is not supposed to teach us how to do war or peace, how to do governance at that time. He did war and he did peace. But this we learn from by principle rather than by form. The form of his war and peace is not abiding to Muslims, is not supposed to be. And he himself didn't say that. In fact, he himself said, in the issues of worldly affairs, I do my best. And you know your worldly affairs better than I do, he said. But in the issues of prophethood, in the issues that are linked to spirituality, to what we call ibadat or acts of worship, then we follow him by essence and by form. Now comes a very important question, which is the relationship between this ethics and the law, or what's called the law of the land, whether here or elsewhere. Also in the Arab world, I said the debate is very similar. The same points are discussed. The relationship between the Shariah, if you understand it as an ethical way of life, and the law of the land. Shariah is always subject of the law of the land, rather than being on top of the law of the land. Because by definition, not every sin in Islam is a crime. That is, I'm speaking from the classic perspective. From the classic perspective, there is a difference between what is a sin, or a mistake, or a moral error in Islam, and what's supposed to be a crime, in the sense that the authorities are supposed to arrest the person who commits the sin and so on. That's by definition. And therefore, it takes a process for something in the Islamic ethics to find its way to the law. And I'm not talking only in America, it's everywhere. Like in the Arab world, for example, in Egypt these days, they're talking about what should go from the Sharia and find itself in the law, find its way to the law. And what everybody had consensus over is that what will be taken from the Sharia to become a law is the family law, and actually that's for Muslims only. Because again, Sharia by definition allows parallel laws in that sense, or is actually referring the people of the book to their books. And therefore, what people agreed about over there is that they have parallel laws for the family laws, and that is because simply the fact that everybody is referring to the religious laws when it comes to their marriage, whether we're talking about Muslims or Copts or Jews. And therefore, the parallel law in the family law is what people agreed about. But other than that, they are talking about Sharia in terms of its principles rather than its rules. Even Al-Azhar, a very well-established institute, in its document commenting on the new Egyptian constitution, it asked for the constitution to include Mabadi' al-Sharia, the principles of the Sharia, as a reference, rather than the rules of the Sharia. And I think this step in the implementation of the Sharia is very important for the debate here, because the law of the land here is very similar to the Sharia in its principles. And therefore, whatever from the ethics of Islam that finds its way to the law is based on how much these ethics are coherent with the principles. And if they're not coherent with the principles, then they are changeable. And yes, of course, there are historic implementations of the Sharia that might not be compatible with today's world or today's principles. And that is also part of the dynamics of the Sharia. Because, as I said, the fiqh changes, the understanding changes with the change of time and circumstances. So, if you're concerned about the issue of Sharia and the law of the land applies whether we're talking about a Muslim majority or a Muslim minority. It is not, the Sharia is not equal to the law, by definition. And in the Arab world now we're more aware that if we make the Sharia equal to the law, like it is in some Arab countries, Saudi Arabia for one example, you create a dictatorship. As simple as that. Because if you want the government to be the guardian of the Sharia in the ethics sense, and therefore it criminalizes and arrests and puts in prison whoever does not pray or whoever does not, wear the appropriate Islamic attire or whatever according to their own interpretation, or whoever, does whatever in a park, then basically you give the state or the government too much power. And we're very aware of that now in the Arab world, especially in the post-revolution, if you wish, era. We're very aware that once you make the government a guardian on the Sharia, then you create a dictatorship. And there is more and more Islamists, quote unquote, calling for the secularization of the state and the Turkish model. And I'm not talking about the seculars or the liberals or the whatever. I'm talking about Islamists, believing that in order to achieve the best goals and objectives of the Sharia, then we have to have a certain new vision of secularity in the Arab world. Mind you, the secularity or secular state in the Arab world will not be similar to the American vision of state. For example, the family law. It's a religious law out there. But at the end, the separation of the government from the religion in the sense of not allowing the government to be a guardian on the Sharia is something that is becoming more and more popular in the Arab world as we move ahead. That no, we don't want a religious government in the Iranian sense, for example, or the Saudi sense for that matter, to put, it's not a Sunni Shia thing, it's both. Whether in the Sunni example of Arabia, Saudi, or the Shia example of Iran, and then the government claims to be the guardian of our ethics. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves stuck with a dictatorship. So we're aware of that. We don't want that anymore. In fact, there is more and more calls for the Sharia or the Islamic ethics to take forms in education and media and organizations that are totally separate from the state. And therefore, we are, in the Arab world, moving towards a smaller state and a more secular state with this new understanding of the Sharia. And for Al-Azhar, for example, I find it very significant to say that it is not the rules of the Sharia that is supposed to be in the constitution, it is the principles of the Sharia. And for those who are not aware, principles of the Sharia, or what's called in Arabic maqasid al-Sharia, are basically justice and common good, and mercy, and the free will. You're talking about the theories of the preservation of mind and soul and life and family, and you're talking about the area of principles is the human area of the Sharia, the human principles of the Sharia. So basically for the state to continue to guard the human principles that everybody agrees on, and for people to live their lives according to their ethics in the way they want, whether they are Muslim or Christian. And this proposal for the Sharia could be very useful to the Sharia debate here in this part of the world, if it's an honest debate, that there is no problem for Muslims to live their ethics the way they want, and to have the arbitration of their family issues or their whatever issues as they want, as long as they don't contradict with the principles upon which the law is built. Once they contradict with the principles, then it is not just illegal, it is not even Sharia. So we're not talking about something that is only illegal, we're talking about something that is not Sharia. For example, I heard about the case that started this whole debate here about the guy and the Muslim man and his wife and the domestic abuse case, without getting into the details. It's a case basically of domestic abuse. Is this allowed by the Sharia? Of course not. Why? Because against the principles of marriage. What is the principles of marriage? Well, the Quran says that marriage is about love and mercy. So if that guy was standing in front of a Muslim judge in Egypt or Morocco or hopefully in Arabia, or the Muslim judge, I hope, would have told him, well, brother, no, this is not Sharia what you're talking about. Come on, this is violence, this is wrong. But the non-Muslim judge, because he tried to perhaps respect the Islamic Sharia that allowed this domestic violence, he told him, okay, that's fine. No, that's not fine. A judge is not supposed to do that, because that goes against the principles. Yes, in his own fiqh, again, to relate it to the fiqh or understanding, in his own understanding, some jurist in some century, in some point of the Islamic world, had allowed that. But who said that this is Sharia? This is wrong. Because now we're talking about a human understanding. The overwhelming human understanding of family relations is love and mercy. This is, ask any true scholar, that's what he or she would tell you. And that's what finds its way to the law in the Muslim majority countries, according to their deliberation and everything. But when somebody in some century had written some opinion that allowed cruel dealing with a spouse, or a cruel dealing with an animal, or something against one's well-being, or a child's well-being, or something that is, and so forth. All of this is not Sharia because it goes against the principles of the Sharia. We have something in the Sharia that's called the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule says that Sharia is all about justice, mercy, wisdom, and common good. Sharia is all about these four. We call them al-kulliyat, or the universals of the Sharia that reign over the particulars. The universals are justice, mercy, wisdom, and common good. And then the Golden Rule goes on. So any opinion that takes Sharia from being about justice to being about injustice, from being about mercy to being about cruelty, from being about wisdom to being about futility, or from being about common good to being about mischief, is not Sharia, even if it is claimed to be so according to an interpretation. We call this the Golden Rule in what we call ijtihad, or reasoning. So when the faqih, the jurist, does his or her reasoning, these principles reign over the particulars. You cannot come with a particular opinion that ends up with injustice or cruelty or mischief or futility. Then it's not Sharia. Yeah, it is fiqh, but it's not Sharia. And that is why I know it's a kind of an academic distinction, but it's becoming much more important than before to hear about these terminologies and to see the distinction between the human understanding of Sharia and the divinity of the Sharia and its principles, and how the principles reign over the particulars. And how, if somebody through the particulars is coming up with a cruel rule, or a rule that lacks mercy or compassion, which is the principle of the Sharia, then it is not Sharia. Even if we're talking about a companion of Prophet Muhammad, even if we're talking about an imam of the Islamic history or current times or whatever it is, nobody has the authority to come up with a fiqh or an understanding that negates the principles. And this is exactly how we can solve the dilemma in this part of the world, because the ethics of the people in America is fine as long as it does not contradict with the principles of the law. Then when it contradicts with the principles of the law, whatever you think is ethical is irrelevant because you committed a crime. in this case, particular example of domestic abuse, it is a crime defined by the law. So whatever a faqih says, this is irrelevant, because the principles of the Sharia are exactly the principles upon which the laws that banned domestic violence are founded. The other issue, the other example that also caused controversy about the guy who wanted benefits for more than one wife. It is actually a debate that sparked a lot of debate here in the Muslim community, and people said, oh, non-Muslims, majority, they are banning us from our right to have multiple wives and so on. And I would refer you to the same example and the same question in Tunis, just a few months ago, about the law that banned polygamy in Tunis. And the Nahda Islamic Party voted with the law, and they banned polygamy. And their view is that the Sharia, I heard Sheikh al-Ghannouchi talking about that, the Sharia is different from the law. Not everything in the Sharia, in your understanding of the Sharia, should find its way to the law. We decided, he said, that the law of banning polygamy is closer to the principles of Islam, given the reality on the ground. And therefore, we have the authority to do that as a government. So somebody told him, you're going to change the Quran. He told him, no, the Quran has polygamy. I'm not going to change the Quran. The Quran is the Quran. But the Quran is not equal to the law. And that is the step, I think, that Islamist parties are taking in the Arab world towards giving the principles reign over the particulars, including the things that could be, quote unquote, historicized, like the issue of multiple wives and so on. And as you know, issues of historicity are subject to different cultures and different understanding and all of that. But in the West today, in Tunis of today, and the debate is going on in Egypt heatedly. Egypt is different, a bit more complex than Tunis. People understand that a polygamous marriage is causing injustices and causing pain and causing and so forth. Cruelty, against the principles, injustice and pain and futility and so forth, and mischief. So if this is the case and it goes against the principles, and an Islamist party in Tunis, or the Islamist party in Tunis, decided to make the law banning polygamy, then it's fair enough for the American law to ban polygamy. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same concept. In fact, the culture here and the reality on the ground here is more commensurate with that. So basically, the points I wanted to make to sum up my speech is that Sharia is the Islamic way of life. The best word that I can translate Sharia with in the English language is ethics, Islamic ethics rather than Islamic law. It cannot find itself in its particulars and its historic manifestations. It cannot find itself a way to the law unless it goes by the principles filter, so that the principles that are interpreted differently in different places and times could filter out the historicist or the historic and classic, or classic if you wish, interpretations into interpretations that are more compatible with justice, mercy, common good, and wisdom. And once you take this step with the Sharia from the particular rules that the jurists had came up with over the centuries into the principles, then you're able to modernize the interpretation of the Sharia, be able in the Arab world to modernize the Islamic law to mean a law that is compatible with today's understanding of principles, and also it solves the problem here and the debate over the Sharia in the courts and the Sharia overriding the law of the land. No, it does not, because the law of the land protects the principles in a more Islamic way than some of the historic opinions that do not apply. I hope that this argument is, I hope it made sense in its complexity, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions. Thank you so much.
I want to ask him a question, but I just want to mention to all of you, in addition to looking up his stuff on Amazon, Triple IT, which is an organization in Virginia, they publish some of his really good work on Maqasid. And in addition to his books, they also have like an abbreviated book, and they even have an even abbreviated. So depending on your reading pleasure, there are great ways to really see, what he's talking about, Jasser's talking about, but also to appreciate, I think, the fact that a lot of his thinking, and you'll see it spelled out if you read his writing, is really, along with some other people, very groundbreaking.
Thank you so much.
Okay, do you have questions? Please, sir.
Yes, I was very, very moving to some extent, but also useful talk. The one thing that struck me as I was listening to this is how very much it parallels the development of what is probably close to the dominant tone in Indonesian Islamic discourse, Chakdur, Gustur, etc. Though, and this is what I'm going to raise, it probably has, there's some indication that its dominance has declined a little bit, at least in the first decade of the century, though there is also some indication that perhaps we're now doing compensation. I wondered first if you were familiar with any of this Indonesian thing, and then I'd like to ask the two very practical issues which have now been raised in that connection. The only problem that sometimes is there is okay, often people are phrased it as you do, you don't want, you want to have the principles just social justice, etc., but you don't want to, it's not that you want to follow each traditional ruling of each particular source of faith. But there are two questions. The question is, if you will, the question of who makes the determination, and there can be an answer. It's the classic American thing is, well, the government doesn't make the determination. Each person or each faith goes to its guides, and they get guidance. In which case, you will have plural guidance. That's precisely the issue which is most controversial at the moment in Indonesia. And in fact, there's an article on it I just noticed, which I haven't read yet, in 2012, one of the key professional journals on this. And the second one is, whoever makes that determination, whether it should be a single source or people should be allowed to go to any source they want, who should be allowed to advertise that they are, because as I say, there's been, both in Indonesia and in Pakistan, for example, with the Ahmadiyya, there's this thing is, yeah, well, maybe the Ahmadiyya can have their own belief, but they shouldn't claim to be Muslim. At least there's some people who said this now. So the question is, what kind of authority for determining what these principles are, and what kind of right to advertise that you are conforming with the principles?
Yeah, thank you. The question of authority is a very important question, because who makes the decisions? Well, from the Islamic perspective, it is the Ummah, it is the people who make the decision, not necessarily the government. And therefore, but of course, the people's will translate into a government. Yet the government is not supposed to monopolize the decision making. And especially if you have alternation of power with the government. That is why the newest ijtihad, the newest opinions in the Islamic political thought in the 20th century found it necessary to have alternation of power and circulation of power. Because once you have circulation of power, then you don't have a specific school or a specific opinion that's dominating and then not allowing others to advertise who they are or whatever. But people, whatever people claim to be is who they are. They want to claim to be Muslims, then they are Muslims. Are they true Muslims? Well, this is up to the Lord. This is not, I mean, this is the basic Islamic thinking. But of course, a government would love to say, oh, no, they are not Muslims, we persecute them, and then so on. And I think we're becoming more aware of that in the Arab world. We don't want to give the government religious authority because of that. And that is why the debate now in the Arab world is to try to give the original religious authorities, the well-established religious authorities, the say in terms of the religious opinions, but not any power in terms of authority. In fact, they are not supposed to participate in that. The Indonesian and the Malaysian experience actually is very useful to the Arab debate today. But I personally noticed a regression recently in religious freedoms and in the way they progressed towards a multi-religious and multicultural society. There are more extreme voices, and the mob is becoming more loud and more violent, and that is an educational problem. It is not a Sharia problem. It's not a legal or juridical or philosophical problem. It's a problem of education. The same thing in the Arab world. You need to educate people the values of coexistence and tolerance and peace and so on. And if the reform starts with the educational reform, I think the Arab world would go a long way, rather than the legal reform or whatever it is, the other reforms. I think in Malaysia and Indonesia as well, the problem is with education rather than the thought. The thought is there, and it's a marvelous thought. And I think they have something to contribute to the Arabs, philosophically speaking. Educationally, they need to work on their educational institutes, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's a very enlightened view you presented. Most liberals in Muslim world today think Turkey is the model of the Muslim state because of this, not only it has done a lot of progress, but also it's an enlightened way the country is run. But unfortunately, the trend is in the other direction. If you look at it, I come from Pakistan, for example, and the question is that if you talk enlightened ways, you do, and if you talk about changing the Sharia in Pakistan, for example, whatever their views, it is a very violent reaction against it.
Mm-hmm.
Even something like blasphemy. No government has the power or the ability to modify it, to change it, although everybody understands that is unfair and wrong. So the situation is that I think the small intellectual elite makes that kind of argument, which is very worthwhile. But whether in practice, how far it can go. For example, in hudud arguments, crime and punishment, which is most emphasized and imposed by these people, how much room there is for modification of that. And if ultimately, if they, as you argue very nicely, if it is incompatible with the ethics, modern ethics, do we really need a separate Sharia other than what is considered to be secular rules, laws, whatever, constitution?
Well, okay, yeah, thank you. I think it's the question, again, is the question of knowledge and the spread of knowledge, a question of education. The reaction whenever you talk about blasphemy laws in Pakistan, for example, is a very violent reaction. That's very unfortunate, because if you have enough education, then you can educate the people that changing one's religion in Islam is not a crime. It is a sin, again, but not a crime. And that is something that not coming from the liberal literature, it's coming from the Islamic literature. I could sit here and argue how Muhammad did not persecute people who committed apostasy in his time. In fact, the Quran is mentioning those who believed and then disbelieved and then believed and then disbelieved. The Quran is mentioning those who believed in the morning and disbelieved in the evening, and so on, and continuing with the story without killing or persecution or anything. I mean, I'm very surprised how popular this opinion is, given that in the classic sources there are so many interpretations of that this is something between people and the Lord. They disbelieve after belief, that is fine, that is between them and the Lord. But it is not something that the state intervenes in, or the authority. The definition of state in Islam is really an authority rather than a state. So The issue of hudud is the same thing. It's a matter of education, a matter of knowledge. Many scholars looked at the hudud as means to an end of the 20th century. Sheikh Abu Zahra and others, many of the elite scholars of the 20th century looked at the whole question as means to an end. Where are they applied in the Arab world, for example? Or and how are they applied? Nobody thinks about that, neither on the public level nor on the scholarly level, except for, of course, some fringe Salafi groups who really want to see, people's hands cut and all that. But the general feeling of the public, ask a person in the street, in addition to many, many of the scholars, view this as means to an end. They might not have the courage to say that or whatever, but really, at the end, it's means to an end, rather than ends in their own right. And therefore, for what we're talking about hudud as in criminal punishment for theft and killing and so on, whatever the law of the land is, then the law of the land applies. And that's the case in Egypt, for example. And that's the case in America too. I mean, the law of the land does not sanction murder or theft. That goes against the principles. If it does, it does not sanction. It has its own punishments, and the punishments are means to an end, and they evolve. It is a matter of education. Once people are educated enough to appreciate the difference between means and ends, and to appreciate the new reasoning and the new wave of scholarship, especially in the 20th century, that modernized a lot of the form to meet the essence, then it is important. Why do we need Sharia altogether? Your second question. No, I think Sharia is a matter of identity for Muslims. I view Sharia as my ethics, and therefore you tell me, no, you don't need that. I have to denounce that in order to live an ethical life and embrace ethics according to any of the schools of ethics. I would tell you, no, I disagree. This is a matter of who I am as a Muslim. But if we insist on the definition of Sharia as personal ethics that do not contradict with the law of the land and that are compatible with the principles of these ethics in their form, then we can balance the issue of identity with the issue of public order. So I hope this answers the question. Yeah, please.
Okay. Let me follow up specifically on Pakistan. I have a book in my library called Education for Death. It was published about 1940. It's on the Nazi educational system. An American educator had been in Germany during the 1930s, asked to visit the schools. And he wrote this book, and he said, these children are being educated to die for Adolf Hitler. That is the purpose of the education. We put a stop to it, obviously, with our victory in the Second World War. In Pakistan, as I understand it, the educational system began to become radicalized in the 1970s. It really moved along in that direction in the 1980s with the war in Afghanistan, and that has continued. Once you get to 2 generations, if you want to change the educational system, my question is, how do you do it? Maybe you can get new textbooks. I keep reading about the textbooks and the problems with the textbooks. Where do you go for the teachers? After 2 generations, where do you get the teachers?
Yeah. Well, you have to have pioneers who create the opportunity for change. And the pioneers have to have the courage to change. I'm sure in Pakistan, and I know some of them, there are great scholars with great minds that think very differently from the general 2-generation kind of atmosphere, but they don't get the chance to do the reform they want to do. There are several reasons from my perspective. One of the reasons is war. War has, its own magic in spreading extremism. We saw the same thing in the Arab world with the Iraq war. We saw the same thing. Once you have a war, people become black and white. So we refer to Islam in its most extreme opinion, and we have to defend ourselves, kind of thing. So war is a hindrance. The war that's happening in the region is hindering the reform that's happening in Pakistan. I heard it from more than one Pakistani friend who are great scholars of the Sharia and would love to, modernize and contemporize the application of the Sharia. And the other problem is the lack of leadership. Like those scholars have to start to be leaders in the street rather than just leaders in the university or in a Sharia court where they sit and philosophize. So leadership in the Islamic parties is rather extreme. And the Islamic parties have to bring about leaders that are less extreme, are more educated, and so forth. And I think this dynamics is happening slightly in Pakistan, again, because of the war. More prominently, for example, in Egypt, the younger generations of Islamists are very different from the older generations. And they are pushing their way up in the leadership. And soon you will see a leader of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin or even of some of the Salafi groups who is talking the exact similar talk that I'm giving here. Because they are pushing themselves up in the leadership. You need leadership of the Islamic authorities and the Islamic groups. Once you have elections in Al-Azhar and you have an elected Azhar scholar, you might go through a cycle of extremism at the beginning, but you will eventually get the true scholars. Not that Sheikh al-Tayyib is not a true scholar, he's a great scholar too, but once you have an election, you will push the moderate voices up, and therefore you can start to make a change. It's a long process.
You might want to look at USIP's website and look up Qamar al-Huda. Qamar, in fact, has worked with religious leaders in Pakistan to produce curricula that then get used in madrasas. I need to interrupt you, but I was involved in the 70s when things got radicalized in Pakistan, also advising the government. And in fact, the situation was less that in universities, not that there weren't issues in terms of teaching and curriculum, more in the madrasas. But even when you look at the madrasas, a lot of the madrasa studies are exaggerated in the sense that there's a significant minority of madrasas that are, in fact, laying the groundwork for radicalization. But, it's like saying all seminaries, quote unquote, are that way. And Qamar al-Huda's writings are based on very intensive programs within the country, pulling together to a remarkable degree religious leaders who, even when he brought them together, he didn't think that they would come and sit in the same room together, let alone to produce a curriculum that then gets used in the schools. Because the key is education, but it's not education of the next generation, it's education of the next generation of religious leaders. Otherwise you don't get that kind of change. And I think there's a good example. And there's enough, from there you can spin out and see other studies on it.
There was actually there's an NGO run by Doug Johnson. He was actually at that IIIT barbecue.
Yeah.
I remember I went to they had a meeting about last year sometime that had been doing a lot of working with madrasas in Pakistan to bring in science and math and science curriculum. And they had in their experience, plurality of the madrasas were very interested in this. I mean, they were eager to have this material. In Pakistan, the problem is that Germany in the 1940s inherited some 150 years of centralization, institutionalization of education. It had tremendous infrastructure. Pakistan, the very reason you have these madrasas is because the state doesn't have the capacity to educate, to actually set up schools where everybody in every little village goes off to their local government school. There's not the infrastructure there. So as much as it's a failing of you can talk about the problem with madrasa curricula, but you can also talk about the impossibility of any kind of systemic change if you don't have a system.
In that seminar, I attended that seminar, and I told John that your work will not be fruitful as long as there is war there, because he was talking about once one of those pilotless aeroplanes, in his own experience, bombs somewhere and 20 people die, or 2 families or whatever. Here is the mob again in the street, and here is all of his peace building program shattered again, and then he has to restart again. So
That's what a common Qamr's program is more successful than Doug's. Doug's has not flown it that well, because Qamar actually is the graduate of the madrasa system in Pakistan, who then went on and studied in the States, was professor at BU, you know, etc. And so when he goes back, he's dealing with a lot of people who still know him, who deal with him, and he's the insider, outsider sort of thing. Whereas it is much more difficult, no matter how good the program is, if it's run by
priest.
somebody with a totally different, you know, profile.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. It's true. Like, reform from the inside, as Professor Esposito say, is very important. You cannot reform the Sharia except through the Sharia scholars, because otherwise people will think conspiracy and everything. Even though the principles could be the same. Somebody from the outside could have the very same principles and could have even the credentials of what we call ijtihad, or reasoning in the law or in the ethics. But it has to be from the inside. But again, I would stress the fact that once you have violence and war and so on, and then your reform projects are hindered from materializing into anything real. And I'm afraid, I hope that the Middle East continues in a more peaceful way, so that the revolutions bring reform in Islamic thought and in Islamic societies, rather than wars. And there are so many possibilities and contingencies of wars these days in the Middle East. But once you have a war, the magic happens. That's it. Forget about reform. Forget about these voices of modernization and contemporarization, and finding the common ground with American ethics or Western ethics or human ethics. Forget about that. Back to the 10 centuries ago law that has to apply, and the mob will support any leader who wants to cut hands and cut necks and everything. And the leader would love to do that, because he will start with the opposition and, you know, the Numeri style. And that's, if he has any knowledge of Islam, he knows that this is not what Islam is about, but it's what politics is about, and they love that. So
I could just add that I think what you said is very pertinent, because in Afghanistan the war has been nearly half a century, and it started even before the Russians came in, and then of course the Americans have been there in the years. So it has accelerated the radicalization. In fact, it has generated the radicalization. A lot of it is imported into Pakistan. All these Taliban philosophy started in Afghanistan. As a result, that because it's very easy to tell the masses that the infidels or Americans or the British are doing this to you. And if you go back to the Sharia 500, 600 years ago, the way we were, the problems will go away. And it's the easy solution and very attractive to the masses. So a lot of radicalization and extremism came in because of all the violence in Afghanistan.
Recent poll in Pakistan says the majority of Pakistanis see the U.S. as the enemy. It doesn't mean that they're terrorists, but you know what we forget is that while drones may kill some terrorists, the collateral damage that drones do and the level of terror that they introduce make people feel, wait a minute.
I agree.
We have time for just one more question. Go ahead.
And please, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to clarify and try to understand. I haven't read your books. You said in the beginning you made a distinction between Sharia and fiqh, and the principles and the actual law. But then at one point you said in Egypt, Al-Azhar asked that the Muqasid Sharia be applied and not the laws of Sharia. So it seems I'm not understanding, it seems there's a confusion. In the Hadith and the Quran, all the prescriptions, the specific prescriptions, would you say that that's not Sharia, that that's fiqh? Or how, you know, so I'm just trying to understand the distinction there. And the other question is more a perspective. In your opinion, your presentation on the difference in definition of Sharia, if you were to look around the Muslim world at the Muslim clergy leadership, fiqh council, whatever, what percentage would you say would agree with this, and what percentage would have a different? I'm just trying to get a feel from your perspective of how widespread this view is in the Muslim world.
Sure. Well, excuse me, I didn't translate the word maqasid. Maqasid is the purpose and the rules or al-ahkam. So we're talking about the purpose of the law versus the rules of the law. The rules of the law are taken from the letter of the script, traditionally, but the purpose is to look at the letter of the script as means to an end, and therefore that end, that purpose, would be the important thing. So for example, in the question of hudud, you look at them as means to deterrence or punishment, but then deterrence and punishment would be the issue, not the means themselves. So what, like the prescriptions of the Quran, as you're in your question, some of them are means to an end and some of them are ends in their own right. The ends in their own right are issues that we call in the Islamic terminology ibadat or ta'budiyat, acts of worship. So the prayers and the pilgrimage and fasting and all the spiritual, if you wish, acts of worship, spiritual related acts of worship, they are ends in their own right. But anything that relates to what we call mu'amalat or worldly dealings, they are means to an end. And of course, there are so many small details and nuances, but basically in the general picture, the differentiation between the acts of worship that Muslims practice until the end of time without reinterpreting the way they pray or the way they fast or the way they do pilgrimage or the way they connect with God in a certain way, versus the issues that are mentioned in the Quran. The Quran is talking about horses and tents, and it's not an Islamic obligation to own a horse or to live in a tent, or like every Muslim would agree that this is means to an end. But when it comes to the issues that are more complex than that, not every Muslim would agree. What is the percentage in scholarly bodies? I would say it's growing, and it's almost 50%. My estimate of what's happening from, let's say, the European Fiqh Council or the North American Council or the different seminars in Islamic universities, there's about half of the people that would agree with these basic ideas. And it is a growing number. Or could be less than half, depending. But still the majority of opinion, but that's for the educated scholars. When you go to the Friday sermon preachers, when you go down to people who come to the mosque, no, the overwhelming majority would not agree with that. 70% would not agree with that, 80%. And again, it's a question of education rather than a question of the complexity of Islamic philosophy itself, but it is the education of that philosophy. In times, as our brother is mentioning, in times 5-6 centuries ago in India or 1,000 years ago in Baghdad, everybody had this understanding because at that time education was high enough, the civilization at that time was at a level where people were sophisticated enough to understand that. So you don't read in the books of history a lot of extremism, except in the war peace area, which is like the external affairs, international affairs area. But in the life of people in the Arab world or in India or in Turkey or in Africa, people were very tolerant and very much by the principle and divergent as diverse. I mean, as diverse they could be in the way they dress and the way they eat and everything. I get shocked sometimes when I read in history. How did we change that far? I think it's a question of education and a question of peace. You need peace in order for Muslims to get the right education. So.
Well, thank you very much. I wish we had more time to have more questions and more discussion. Time really flew by. I want to thank Dr. Jasser Auda, and it's always extremely important to remember none of this would take place without a tremendous amount of hard work put in by these ACMCU staff, especially Mona Magahed, who did a terrific job organizing this. So we thank our guests, we thank the work of the staff, and we hope to see you at we have another event.
October 31st, before you go out trick-or-treating, we have a whole day on Common Word on religious freedom and pluralism. And if you want to hear, for example, a big conference, want to hear a Southeast Asian perspective on, for example, women, family, and it's not only Southeast Asian, but it's the founder of Sisters in Islam, who is also now the executive director of a global women's movement. She will, I can guarantee it ahead of time, set the room on fire. I mean in the best sense. And Mr. Shariah, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia-Herzegovina, will be there, who's both an Azhar graduate and PhD from Chicago. And we will have a whole host of people from different parts of the world addressing this and other issues. The other thing I wanted to just mention, for those of you who are interested in this, particularly since given Georgetown's identity, if you're looking at reform, take a look at the process of reforming Roman Catholicism in the 20th century. Reformers were a vanguard. They were a minority. And in the early days, the Vatican, as well as most conservative clergy, that I'm not saying most clergy were conservative, but most, would have said, who cares what they think? They were a bunch of bright theologians. All that really counts is we've got the religious power. Well, that changed with Vatican II. The reality of it is 50 years later, and of course you get the pushback effect. And so there are an awful lot of people who come out of the rocks again. But what I want to point out is when one looks at the Muslim world, it's the same thing. You're talking about a minority, but a dynamic vanguard, and the difference is that this has been retarded by a couple of centuries of colonial rule and authoritarian governments, and establishments that manipulate religion. So it's very complex, but this is a growing body. But you can either be alienated, have your books burned, or have yourself, as happened in that celebrated case of Pakistan, where no lawyer would step up and defend somebody who was killed because of a Muslim who was killed because of his statements. No lawyer in the country would step forward because they were afraid that they would, have a problem. So it's a very fluid time, but an interesting one. I think the example of Tunisia and some of the possibilities out of Egypt could be interesting in that way. Certainly some of the positions taken in Tunisia. But we'll see you on the 31st. We also provide. At the end of the day, Mona Magai will provide costumes for those of you who need one to go out and trick or treat.
Thank you very much.